Well, as people get settled, I'd like to wish you a very good morning on this cold Washington, D.C. morning. My name is Carol Benedict, and as chair of the History Department, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our conference on cultures of violence. We're delighted to have you all here, especially those of you who've traveled so far from India, from the United Kingdom, from South Africa, and Australia. And of course, those of you who have come from closer afield, we're also delighted to have you here. Violence is often understood as an unfortunate but essential element of human nature that erupts episodically and unpredictably. Such an understanding naturalizes violence in ways that desensitizes us and makes violence seem inevitable and endemic to society. This workshop brings together researchers who have a critical analytical interest in the subject of violence, but who approach it in different ways and in very distinct time periods. Through examination of the theoretical, empirical, and aesthetic dimensions of violence from multiple disciplinary perspectives and in different cultural and historical contexts, we seek to understand how violence is perpetuated and normalized through institutions, through memories, and discursive practices. Engaging our critical capacities to recognize the brutality of violence is a step towards finding ways towards a less violent future, or so that is our hope. Now, before introducing Professor Stuart Carroll, our keynote speaker for the morning and for the entire conference, I'd like to take a moment to thank all the people who've made this event possible. As you're aware, this is the first of three trilateral research workshops organized in collaboration with the Center for Historical Studies of JNU and also King's College in London. Funding for our conference has been provided by Georgetown University's Office of the Provost in the form of an Engaging India grant, a central goal of which is to foster relationships between Georgetown University and academic institutions and scholars in India. So again, I reiterate our great appreciation for those of you who've come from India on this occasion. This workshop is also made possible by funds from the Department of History's Quigley Endowed Lecture Fund, which honors the memory of the late Dr. Carroll Quigley, who during his time at Georgetown University decades ago now, was one of the most popular lecturers in the department's history. Our other sponsors include Jeff Anderson and the Center for German and European Studies, Victor Cha and the Center for Asian Studies, Osama Abi Murshid and the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, Tom Banchoff and Melody Fox Ahmed from the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and also the Indian Embassy in Washington, D.C. I'd also like to extend a very special thanks to the conference organizers, Professor James Collins, Professor Osama Abi Murshid, Ms. Kathy Gallagher, Javier Puente, Clara Puena Arcela, and especially to Professor Aparna Vaidik, who was the principal conference organizer and who really pulled everything together for us. Now, we're honored to have as our keynote speaker for the conference, Professor Stuart Carroll, professor and department head in history at the University of York. Professor Carroll has wide-ranging interests in the social, cultural, and political history of France from the mid-15th to the mid-17th century. He began his research on political cultures during the wars of religion, and particularly on the interface between noble followings and popular religious mentalities. More recently, he has published several major books on violence in early modern France. Blood and Violence in Early Modern France from Oxford University Press in 2006 explores the nature of vengeance in the Renaissance society through the practice of dueling. Martyrs, this is just to establish he knows a bit about violence, right? Martyrs and Murderers, The Geese Family and the Making of Europe, also from Oxford in 2009, tells the story of 3 generations of one of the richest, most powerful, and violent families in 16th century France. He's also the editor of a volume, which neatly has the same title as our conference, Cultures of Violence, Interpersonal Violence in Historical Perspective, which came out from Palgrave Macmillan in 2007. Professor Carroll is twice winner of the Nancy Roquefort Prize for the best essay on early modern France, written in English. He received that in 2000 and 2003. And he's currently working on a history originally of neighborliness, which sounded the opposite of violence, right? But he tells me this morning that it's going to be a people's history of civil society in Europe during the Reformation. This morning, he'll be speaking on the topic of theorizing violence. And before I turn the podium over to Professor Carroll, I'd like to, again, to express my deep appreciation for our sponsors, for the organizers, and also to express our great pleasure at having you all with us here tomorrow and also on Saturday. Thank you very much. Professor Carroll.
Thanks, Carol, and particularly thanks to Aparna and to Kathleen for organising this. It's been fantastically well organised. I just want to say that here, you've heard my bio. I'm a European historian. There are many Indian, Chinese historians here, historians of Africa. I'm going to talk about the West today. But I think it'll be quite clear from my talk that when I talk about the West, the language of violence is really a way of talking about Western civilization. And I think that's very important for the ways in which the West has thought about its dominion over the rest of the world. So I think you'll get that very clearly, that thinking about violence in the West is often a way of thinking about civilization and the ways in which the West has seen itself as better and able to dominate others. So I think that will be very clear in the talk, but I'll be very much focusing on the West. Violence fascinates us from Homer to Call of Duty. It's ubiquitous. It's the very stuff of history, for violence tells us something about the human condition. Violence has its own peculiar dynamic that rapidly turns the world upside down. Once a fragile consensus has been shattered, a chain of events is unleashed. Violence thus has a social and political potency because it breaks norms and overturns consensus. It can transform the social environment, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. It's not always a bad thing. And yet, we know little about it. Yes, there's a hypertrophic literature on war. Yes, there are journals and master's programs devoted to genocide. But these are subcategories which overlook the everyday and banal, the quotidian. And since we're in Washington, let's illustrate this absence with some local history. We know that around 600,000 combatants died in the American Civil War. But this is not the whole story, as that great American actor, Kevin Costner, has recently shown us. I'm not talking about the film The Bodyguard, but the recent TV miniseries, The Hatfields and McCoys. I don't know if you've seen that, which dramatises the bloody feud between two clans in West Virginia from the 1860s to the 1890s. The feud hinges on a series of seemingly trivial altercations. Asa McCoy is confronted in a saloon as a Yankee. Floyd Hatfield and Randolph McCoy dispute the ownership of a pig. The consequences of those altercations are deadly. But what looks like a trivial dispute is usually men fighting to retain self-respect and their position in society. While in Europe, homicide rates were falling in the 1850s and 60s, in the US, they were rising dramatically in the decade prior to the Civil War. Immigration is a red herring. The Irish were 4 to 5 times more homicidal in the United States in the 1850s and 60s than they were at home. Had they continued to kill at the same rate as they did in Ireland, they would have been the least murderous of all Americans. What transformed your placid Irishman when he arrived was the combustible atmosphere caused by differences about slavery and the Constitution. Vigilantism arrived in the 1850s, and there was a huge spike in homicide rates as secession approached, with lynch mobs attacking their political opponents. From Texas to Missouri, the Confederate borderlands seethed with banal, everyday violence. And post-war violence was endemic too.
The cowboy culture was born out of civil war and the hatreds that pitted southern cattlemen, gamblers and saloon owners against northern lawmen and businessmen. Revenge, feuds and property disputes shaped the local landscape. The gunfight at the OK Corral, long since domesticated into US popular culture, was a profoundly politicized event. So the history of homicide is important to study for 3 reasons. First of all, homicide is a universally heinous crime in all societies. It's recorded far back into time. And these records not only allow us to chart the rise and fall of violence over the long term, but they allow us to make comparisons between different societies. Secondly, we know that homicide rates are good indicators of other sorts of violence. Homicide, we know, is as American as apple pie, but the US also has very high rates of rape as well. And historians can therefore use homicide data to explore why the variation in violence occurs and why it falls and rises, and what that tells us about a given society. Thirdly, during periods of civil conflict, the proliferation of politically charged homicide will be matched by an increase in garden variety homicide, as individuals adopt the same hostile and predatory attitudes towards their neighbours that political partisans show towards their opponents. We know that in periods of civil conflict, familial domestic violence increases. Civil conflict privatizes violence. This was true for Europe during its religious wars and during the era of the Wars of Revolution. It was true for America in the era of abolition. It's true for Russia after 1989. It's true for Iraq, Syria, or Egypt today. Now, this is very much the most recent research, but you should like to know how we got here. So what I'm going to do today, if I can get there, is to look in the rest of the lecture at the 5 most influential theories of violence and how that's influenced historians. I think that's helpful for you in your conference, even if you don't study Europe like I do. It's good to kind of get this background for the whole conference. It will give you a template with which to work from. So I'll take them in roughly chronological order of their appearance. Psychology, which appears in the 19th century. Historical sociology, very much a product of the early and mid-20th century. Anthropology, again a product of the mid-20th century. Sociobiology and evolutionary psychology, which has 19th century roots, but really gets going as an intellectual discipline more recently in the 1970s. And finally, I'll look at political culture, which I really think is a recent development, and I think that's emerged very much since the US invasion, US and British invasion, I probably should say there, of Iraq. The first thing to say, and it's important to stress, is that none of these ways of looking at violence are mutually exclusive. Violence is a dynamic category and is especially suited to interdisciplinary dialogue. And there's one major field of interpretation I'm not going to discuss today. That's Marxism, which has recently been restated in a book by Slavoj Zizek. The problem, I would argue, of replacing a concrete experience with the Marxian notion of a mute pressure of relations is that it removes the idea of an act, replacing an analytical category with a metaphor. This means the inflation of the concept of violence. Taxes and bureaucracy become violence in the Marxian notion. But if every form of social structure is an act of violence, it becomes ubiquitous and the concept loses its power of differentiation. So I'm going to suggest, just for the purposes of today, we can talk about it later, I'm going to leave it out in the lecture. Any discussion of theories of violence must begin with Freud. Before Freud, violence was not a subject for scientific analysis, but a moral problem that had to be tamed and overcome. It was delineated by the taboos of custom, law, and religion. Freud's structural model of the psyche, in which children acquire a conscience, the superego, which keeps their biological impulses, the id, in check, brought science to bear on the matter for the first time. Freud's biological approach was largely ahistorical. His thinking was most developed in Civilization and its Discontents, which was published in 1929. Civilization is understood as the ongoing process of repressing man's biological instincts. Quote, the inclination to aggression is an original, self-subsisting, instinctual disposition in man. It constitutes the greatest impediment to civilization. Freud identified the internalization of these drives as the cause of our current neuroses. Freud's juxtaposition between the childlike nature of medieval man, who is the barbarian other, to our civilized self, the child to our man, was firmly embedded in 19th century historical thinking, in which history is a progressive, linear process. And Freud's approach was most famously adopted and popularized in 1919 in Huizinga, Dutch historian, in The Waning of the Middle Ages. Probably not that widely read today, but it's certainly one of the most influential works of history in the 20th century. It reinforced the divide between the medieval and the modern, a divide that is cultural and mental rather than economic and social. And violence and man's attitude towards it are crucial to this dichotomy. Huizinga identifies violence with the passions, to which medieval man is enslaved. A man of extremes, he is quick to anger and insensitive to the misfortunes of others. The modern self is contrasted starkly with the medieval self. The rise of self-restraint is ineluctably tied to modernity. The advance of civilization is associated with the period that we now call the early modern, during which the self undergoes a transformation with the dissemination of Renaissance concepts of virtue and the more systematic inculcation of Christian moral principles as a result of the Catholic and Protestant Reformations. Freud's ideas continue to be important today. They resonate for critics of modernity. For many modern thinkers, the costs of the coercive and disciplinary efforts required by modern bourgeois self-restraint are too high. For Michel Foucault, quote, the life and time of man are not by nature labour, but pleasure. Restlessness, merry-making rest, needs, accidents, desires, violent acts, robberies. Following Nietzsche, he wishes us to recapture this Dionysian spirit, and with regard to civility, presupposes that we've lost more than we've gained. The founding father of sociology, Max Weber, asserted that the state is one that successfully claims the monopoly of political force within a given territory. It's been hugely influential in thinking about violence. Norbert Elias, writing in the 1930s, adapted this maxim. Like Freud, Elias saw violence as a product of human nature. But he inverted the Freudian approach by showing that the psyche is moulded by society and history. Each phase of human social organisation produces codes of behaviour that inhibits or controls behaviour. Gradually, social constraint is internalised into self-constraint. Refined manners, predicated on sensitivity to others, translated into greater vigilance of the self, one's emotions and impulses. Growing demands for polite conduct and civility meant that impulses and outbursts of emotions were increasingly controlled, and that crude manners less tolerated. Repression of aggressive instincts is integral to the civilizing process. That's what Elias's famous thesis. And it's the princely court which acts as the model society. The key transformation in the West, according to Elias, comes in the early modern period with the transformation of the nobility. Elias associated this process with state formation, since princely courts were arenas where new standards of behaviour were learnt and disseminated. Warriors were turned into courtiers. Violent instincts were tamed and suppressed. He followed Weber in arguing that violence is increasingly confined to barracks. The move from expressive violence derived from passion to instrumental violence based on reason is again a signifier of modernity. It was essential, according to Elias, to the creation of civil society and the rise of the West. In Elias's schema, France is very much the model. It was here the word civilité, civility, first began to take on the connotations that the term civilization enjoyed during the Enlightenment. Civility in the 17th century, civilisation in the 18th, denoting an ongoing historical process from barbarism towards a state of perfection through education and refinement. Now today, Elias continues to receive strong support from social scientists as well as historians. The criminologist Manuel Eisner, there we go, has compiled the most comprehensive set of homicide data yet for Western Europe. You can see from this graph, homicide rates are calculated per homicide per year, per 100,000 population. That's the way in which social scientists do that. The data that he's compiled tells us that there's little change in the long run in the age and sex of violent offenders from 1200 to 2000. Homicide has historically been a masculine phenomenon. Killers are overwhelmingly men, and their victims are overwhelmingly male. Societies with a high homicide rate are characterized by high rates of male-to-male violence. Secondly, according to this graph and Eisner's research, violence has declined significantly in the past 6 centuries. Rates may have been as high as 20 per 100,000 in the late Middle Ages, dropping to 10 in 1600, and ending in the lowest historically recorded rate of 1 per 100,000 in the mid-20th century. We are 20, in the West, in England, we're 20 times less violent, according to this graph, than our medieval forebears. This leads Eisner to the conclusion that the long-term fall in homicide rates in Western Europe can only be explained by the civilizing process. We've become more civilized. Now, objections to this can really divide into two camps. One is based on chronology, and the other on local environment. Firstly, I don't know if there are any medieval historians here, but medievalists have long been unhappy with this tag of the childlike Middle Ages. In the light of the horrors of the First World War, Hausinger modified his original views. He rejected Freud's psychology, underlying the role of ritual and particularly chivalry in limiting violence. As a refugee from Nazi Germany, Elias was keen to advertise the merits of aristocratic French civilité over backward and provincial German bourgeois Kultur. And French historians have strong patriotic reasons for supporting Elias. More recently, however, the Germans have fought back, and they've been at the forefront of attempts to rescue the reputation of the Middle Ages as a violent and disorderly age. In particular, they've been impressed by the late medieval city's role in pacification. Their claim seems to be supported by the statistics. If you look at this graph carefully, the biggest fall comes not during the early modern period, but in the 15th century. Secondly, the fact that homicide rates did not fall everywhere at the same rate raises the issue of environment. This is an aggregated picture from all over Western Europe. Most of the research comes from the northwest of Europe, from France, northern France, the Low Countries and England. But this was not the civilized centre of the world in the 16th and 17th centuries. Italy had much higher rates of violence than elsewhere in Europe, and they stayed higher for much longer. In the 19th century, Italy has the highest rates of homicide in Europe. Until the mid-17th century, the inhabitants of the Italian Renaissance city was exposed to much higher levels of cultural, social, and economic interaction, and far in advance of anything in the north. This was the centre of the civilized and refined world, but they had very high rates of violence. Perhaps the strongest critics of Elias have emerged from the discipline of anthropology. In The Theft of History, Jack Goody attacked Elias for crude Eurocentrism. From the 1930s, anthropologists developed a radically different view of violence to historical sociologists and psychologists. Their field work showed that primitive societies developed social mechanisms for the control of violence, and that self-control and propriety were highly prized. Anthropology has had a profound impact on historians' understanding of the law and of violence. Let's take the example of the feud. It's one I know well. Modern interest in the origins of the feud come from two divergent historiographical traditions, 20th century traditions. In most of Western Europe, the foundations were laid by the anti-Eurocentrist direction in anthropology. For example, the work of Evans Pritchard and Max Gluckman on Africa. Many of you will be familiar with that. More controversially, perhaps less well known, in Germany, it derived from the anti-modernist, one might say anti-Weberian turn in constitutional history. Otto Brunner's Land und Herrschaft is probably the greatest historical work of the Nazi period. And his membership of the Nazi Party makes that book very, very controversial. He found that medieval feuds, far from being violent, were actually largely bloodless. They were shaped by a strong concept of legal order and regulated according to rigid rules of the game. And this is also what anthropologists found among primitive peoples. The division between the law, feuding, and peacemaking was artificial. In pre-modern societies, self-regulating mechanisms existed which ensured that vengeance rarely evolved into endless vendettas, and feuds were not interminable because of the social and cultural pressures for peace. Crucial to the recent work on anthropology, particularly cultural anthropology, is the concept that violence is perspectival. According to David Riches, violence, quote, is an act of physical hurt deemed legitimate by the performer and illegitimate by some witnesses. Precisely because violence's legitimacy is contestable, it is open for debate, and so rhetorical strategies are employed that persuade people of its acceptability and reduce the chances of a reply in kind. Self-defense plea, that kind of thing. Understanding that triangular relationship between performer, victim, and witness will tell us a lot about the political and social environment within which the act took place, occurred. Steven Pinker, who you probably know teaches at Harvard, will have none of this postmodern nonsense, postmodern relativism. In 2002, in The Blank Slate, Pinker launched an attack on what he calls the standard social science model, and he launched his attack on anthropologists in particular. He targeted the notion that our minds are a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and also Rousseau's idea of the noble savage, the notion that evil comes not from human nature, but is a consequence of civilization itself. Let's quote. For many years, intellectuals, that's lefties, I think, in his parlance, tried to deny the significance of history with two myths. One is the myth of the peaceful savage, where savages or hunter-gatherers are thought to be representative of human nature, uncorrupted by the malign influences of civilization. According to this myth, among pre-agricultural peoples, war is rare, mild, and ritualized, or at least it used to be before contact with Westerners. This is romantic nonsense. War has always been hell. 2010, to widespread publicity, he applied this to the study of violence. Pinker claimed that contrary to what we'd all imagined, the 20th century wasn't an unpleasant period, wasn't full of violence, it was the most peaceful century we've ever had. And the reason for this was the civilizing process. Quote, Elias was right. He's the most important thinker you've ever heard of. The only thinker worth knowing. For Pinker, it is axiomatic that the past is shockingly violent and that we are presently living in an age of perpetual peace. And the reason for this is that we are wired to violence. The mind is a complex system of cognitive and emotional faculties implemented in the brain, which owe their basic design to the process of evolution. Some of these faculties incline towards violence, some towards peace. These predispositions are part of the evolutionary process. We are survival machines who elbow their competitors from finite resources and territory, who will outproduce their competitors. Neuroscientists have discovered the part of the brain that regulates argumentativeness, lack of concern for others, impulsivity, shallowness, and even violence. There's a scientific revolution going on. Recent book on deep history from one of his colleagues at Yale. And we can now track this in the mind. We can now literally get into the minds of killers. And this, Pinker calls our 5 inner demons. Predation, violence, is practical and exploitative. The second is rooted in dominance, otherwise known to us as the alpha male. For Pinker, quote, "The problem of violence is a problem of young, unmarried men competing for dominance. Violence is really the problem of there being too much testosterone in the world. This desire for dominance is related to evolutionary imperative. In males, he claims status is related to mating. Revenge is a primal urge. Quote, "The neurobiology of revenge begins with a rage circuit in the midbrain hypothalamus amygdala pathway, which inclines an animal who has been hurt or threatened to lash out. Sadism, the joy of hurting. This can be found in psychopathic personalities. It's in the brain. Ideology. This is not identified in one brain, but distributed across the brains of many. This is the desire of one group to dominate others. Most dangerous, of course, when it gives birth to a collective movement headed by a leader who is narcissistic, lacking in empathy, and craves admiration. Guess who he's referring to? The good news from Pinker is that this is offset by the better angels of our nature. Suffice to say here that self-control is closely associated with the civilizing process. The frontal lobes of the brain are the most developed, most involved in self-control. They allow us to control impulses and delay self-gratification. Impulsive violence results in the malfunction of this part of the brain. The Middle Ages was an age of uncouthness, dissolute behavior, and above all, violence. We have evolved since then and learned to control our impulses. Now, I just want to make 3 observations about Pinker. It's a very long book. We could spend all day talking about it. First of all, I want to make the point that it's absolutely hopeless history. Pinker wants us to turn to a dated linear history as progress story. He's an Enlightenment Whig, literally. He wants to place 21st century science in the service of 19th century history. He ignores evidence that anything that gets in his way is just ignored. There's no mention of Hitler, whose fastidious manners mask the monster. He egregiously distorts the statistics. I'll give you one example of that. There's lots of them. This is one of the graphs he shows, that the 20 worst things people have done to each other. And he lists them according to the number of people killed, and then he re-ranks them according to population. So he said, well, we think that the Second World War was the worst thing, but 55 million people died. That's pretty bad. But actually, if you look at the population of the world, it's not that bad. The trouble with this is that the comparisons are totally nonsensical. He places the slave trade, he says, a lot worse than the Second World War. And what he doesn't point out is that slave trade went on for 3 centuries. The Second World War went for 6 years. It might be worth pointing out that 2 of the things, from our Chinese historian's point of view, the Lushan and Taiping revolts, which have very, very high death rates, according to Pinker, were revolts very much against the state, peasant revolts, which rather undermines his argument the state is always a pacifier. He's very keen on the idea of Hobbes. The state is a good thing. The state is always a pacifier. No, it isn't. The danger with sociobiology is that we confuse biological determinism with biological potential. And there's a more sinister undertow at work here. For the lessons derived from sociobiology tend to replicate rather conservative political agendas. Here, for example, is Steven Pinker's mentor, E.O. Wilson, the godfather of sociobiology. In hunter-gatherer societies, men hunt and women stay at home. This strong bias persists in most agricultural and industrial societies. On that ground alone appears to have a genetic origin. My own guess is that the genetic bias is intense enough to cause a substantial division of labour, even in the most free and egalitarian societies. Even with identical education and equal access to all professions, men are likely to continue to play a disproportionate role in political life, business and science. God forbid. Anyone who knows anything about peasant or early industrial societies knows that women do not stay at home. It's nonsense, absolute nonsense. Now, sociobiology has been much more influential in the US, and there's a reason for that. That just reflects the political right, the strength of the political right in the US, much more so than in Europe. The great problem for however, theoretically for supporters of the civilizing thesis comes. It's all right to discuss the decline and account for that. Is when you get the upswing. What happens when violence starts to go up again? Because then you've got to invent another theory. Pinker argues that rising rates of homicide in the West from the 1960s are the result of the permissive society. Guess who that is? Probably from there. I'll tell you later if you don't know. This, he argues, is caused by a decline in manners and codes of behaviour. Flouting propriety and etiquette, letting it all hang out. What he fails to add is that increasing homicide rates stopped in the 1990s. In the United Kingdom, homicide rates have halved in the last 10 years. They were about 1,000 in 2002. They've gone down to 550 last year. Are we really saying that this is because we've become more buttoned up? We'll be more happy, more polite and restrained than the hippie generation? I don't think so. In 2006, Britain and the US invaded Iraq. The neocons who willed that invasion felt no need to plan for post-war pacification with the consequences that we all know about. Such thinking is perhaps reflective of a complacent Weberianism that perhaps dominated US political science. How much better the advice of another German, Hannah Arendt? She targeted Weber for equating power with violence. For the state, the civitas is consensual too. Power is the essence of government, not violence. Violence is by nature instrumental. Like all means, it always stands in need of guidance and justification through the end it pursues. Power needs no justification. It needs legitimacy. Violence can be justifiable, but it can never be legitimate. Power and violence are therefore opposites, according to Arendt. Violence appears where power is in jeopardy. Violence can destroy power. It is utterly incapable of creating it. But the foundering of the neocon project in Iraq turned the tap on research funding in the US, and there's a lot of work coming out recently. And what the new research highlights is the ways in which the public and the private become blurred during periods of civil unrest. This is important because, as I said before, we know that during moments of political crisis, all forms of homicide, not just political killings, are likely to increase. As the Arab Spring reminds us, civil war privatizes violence, ensuring that even when peace is restored, homicide rates can remain stubbornly high for generations. As Stathis Kalivas, political scientist at Columbia, explains, the causes of intercommunal violence are, quote, intimate and banal. For the many people who are not naturally bloodthirsty, note the word there, naturally, people aren't naturally bloodthirsty, civil war offers irresistible opportunities to harm everyday enemies. Local and personal grievances are transformed into lethal violence. Only after it occurred was the violence endowed with meaning, be it political, religious, or ethnic. Now, the best example of what you might call the political culture model of violence is the United States itself. It's the one I began with. The US is a civilized, advanced Western state, but it has consistently high rates of homicide. You can see the comparison. The US is at the top compared to Australia, Canada, England, and Wales. It diverges from the Western European model we saw earlier. It has consistently high rates of homicide. Now, many theories have been put forward to explain American exceptionalism, poverty, guns, race. Maybe, according to Eric Monkinen, American men are just meaner. The problem with all these explanations is that the American homicide rate is highly regional. and it fluctuates wildly. You can see, I don't need to point out the regions. I think, are we close to what? I think we're pretty close to the south there, and you can see there, that's the rate from 1937 to 41, but pretty much consistent. Well, not consistent, but you get that sense of the vast regional variation of the American continent. In American Homicide, Randolph Roth argues that the predisposition to violence is rooted in feelings and beliefs, and that this is related to an individual's place in society. Even the most seemingly trivial altercations are governed, what he would argues, by 4 variables. Homicide rates can soar quickly. Alternatively, if citizens feel that their society is stable and legitimate, they feel a strong bond with others. When people feel that the social hierarchy is just, violence is not necessary, for respect and homicides will fall. Men who lose faith in the state will take up arms on behalf of their faction or race. When government breaks down, men simply kill in order to get rid of... Okay, I keep using the word men because it usually is men. I'm not trying to be sexist here. But once learned, homicidal habits are hard to break and can be passed down the generations. In the US, homicide rates were affected for decades by political instability and hatred. The conflicts that arose during the Civil War and Reconstruction, according to Roth, continue to this day. Southern men, you can see, if you remember from that previous slide, both black and white have these almost built into their DNA, those events. And this explains the regional variation. The second correlate, according to Roth, is confidence in government and those who run it. If government shares their values and speaks for them, they will feel greater self-respect and gain confidence in their dealings with people. They participate in public life more. What matters is they feel represented and included. When men doubt the honesty and competence of public officials and question the legitimacy of government, they feel frustrated, alienated, and dishonoured. Feeling dishonoured can prompt men to take offence when no slight was intended. Feeling alienated can lead them to view others as predators and prey. Intense frustration can make men hot-tempered in ordinary disputes. And Roth uses, it's not a very good reproductionist, Roth uses this poll related to trust in US government. The percentage you trust the government. It's the inverse proportion to the homicide rate. He says you can track this. If you trust the government more, the homicide rate will go down. The third correlate is patriotism or kinship with your countrymen. A sense of connectedness beyond kin and neighbourhood suppresses violence. Problems occur where boundaries along lines of race, class, or national lines exclude people, and people who are disconnected are more likely to kill. And so the rapid decline in US homicide rates in the last 10 years is therefore entirely predictable. 9/11 reignited a sense of patriotism. The election of Barack Obama has given African Americans a greater sense of belonging and dignity. Inequality does not in itself cause violence. As long as citizens accept the justice or inevitability of hierarchy and believe they can defend rights or resist in non-violent ways, then homicide rates are moderate. However, if men are insecure or have no hope of winning respect, they're more likely to become violent. A sudden loss of standing means that every insult, every challenge, and every setback takes on greater significance. Disputes with peers, no matter how trivial they seem to us, to an outsider, become defining moments in which reputations are permanently damaged. So you'd like to hear some conclusions. Violence differs across time and between societies because it's closely related to the social and political context. Whether an argument between two parties ends in violence depends as much on the expectations of others and whether a resort to an act of violence would repair damaged integrity. Widely different forms of violence are governed by rules, prescriptions, and protocols. Violence is therefore a cultural category whose idiom, meaning, and discourse will depend on the context. Do the low homicide rates of 1930s Germany and Japan lead us to the conclusion that these were non-violent societies? No. We know the Viking is a violent because he wields a skull-splitting axe in his hand. But what of the architect of mass murder, Tony Blair, for example? or the pilot who eviscerates his victim from 30,000 feet. New interdisciplinary thinking will require a more nuanced approach to application, a more nuanced application of theory. The privileging of macro-level causal explanation in ill-defined categories such as ideology, nature, belief, or culture will not help us explain how violence escalated or was contained. As analytical categories, they are static concepts that cannot explain violence's peculiar dynamics, triangular relationship. Let's take, for example, the example of masculinity. The evolutionary psychologists Daly and Wilson were the first to highlight the fact that in all societies that have been studied, men overwhelmingly account for the killers and their victims. The victim is often killed following a confrontation or altercation of seemingly trivial origin. However, far from being a product of our biological hardwiring, I would argue this insight fits better with anthropological models of violence, since homicide rates vary so widely across time and space. Male-on-male violence is not generally a one-sided event in which the victim plays a passive role. Indeed, he's often the initiator of the exchange. Murder is most commonly the outcome of a dynamic between the offender-victim and, in many cases, bystanders. What may look like a trivial altercation to the police officer, judge, or historian may in fact be central to the actor's sense of masculinity, maintaining face, demonstrating character, not wanting to be pushed around. In short, the requirement to defend one's honour and reputation. And the event tells us more about social relations and an individual's place in society than it does about the male gene. And I think this picture that I've painted is also supported by the recent work on genocide. Anthropologists who have interviewed ordinary Hutu militiamen have shown that situational factors were far more important in explaining the dynamics of violence than culture and identity, whatever they are. It was civil war, the consequence of a Tutsi insurgency since 1989, which provided the Hutu oligarchy with its best weapon yet against pluralism. Before civil war, communities were highly integrated, and there was little evidence that mass killing was the result of deep-seating, pre-existing antipathy or prejudice between Hutus and Tutsis. And historians have recently been successful in getting inside the totalitarian mind. We can no longer dismiss mass killing as simply beyond human understanding or attribute it solely to ideology. The Nazis had a moral sense, however warped. According to Timothy Schneider, to dismiss the Nazis or Soviets as beyond human concern or historical understanding is to fall into their moral trap. Their motives for killing, however revolting to us, made sense to them. Devotion and faith do not make the Germans good, but they do make them human. Like everyone else, they had access to ethical thinking, even if their own thinking was dreadfully misguided. Mass killing is not, by and large, the work of fanatics. Jan Gross's book, Neighbours, his study of the murder of the Jews of Jedwabne by their Polish neighbours in 1941, shows how violence was driven by atavistic concerns, expropriating Jewish property, and vengeance against perceived traitors was more important than anti-Semitic motivations. Events are crucial to understanding the violence. The social and political environment of Jedwabne, the village, had been transformed, first by the Soviet and then by the Nazi occupation. And this is also the lesson of Christopher Browning's famous study of the role of Police Battalion 101 in The Final Solution. These men were reservists. They were ordinary middle-aged men and not ideologically committed Nazis. What led them to joining the violence were social ties and group dynamics. And this recent research I've highlighted leads me to the conclusion that it's the transformation of the environment and of social relations that leads one to commit violence that one is not normally predisposed to do. Thank you.